Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. What's funny about the prequel series is that the whole time while audiences are watching, most of us know about the fate of Anakin Skywalker. We know who he'll become and what he'll do. Yet, at least in this part of his journey, we still root for Anakin. We want him to succeed, to win his battles and vanquish his foes. What's even more strange is that for most Star Wars fans, the best prequel movie is the last one, Revenge of the Sith. And it's the best film because we get to see Anakin Skywalker essentially fall apart here and betray everything he's stood for up until now. And it's an absolutely glorious and somewhat abrupt transition. At its core, the prequel tale of Anakin is a tragedy. It's a story of failure, and it foreshadows the great suffering and devastation that would come due to Anakin's actions. But still, it draws the audience in. It makes us invested. And that final duel between brothers is something that's quite hard to take your eyes from. I want to focus on Anakin's line to Obi-Wan Kenobi right before he draws his blade. In my opinion, this moment is really just the end of the beginning of his fall to the dark side.
If you're not with me, then you're my enemy.
It's not the most famous line in Star Wars. Heck, it's not even Anakin's most famous line, which I believe is just about sand. But this single quote is probably the most political pieces of dialogue that George Lucas has written in all of his Star Wars films. Before we continue, a quick word from our sponsor for today's video, World of Warships. If you guys like naval combat, then World of Warships might be the game for you. It's one of the best naval simulation games out on PC and console, and it's free to play. Join up to 24 other players in massive watery arenas. World of Warships has more than 40 unique maps with dynamic weather effects and amazing water graphics. Now, the focus of World of Warships is obviously the vessels themselves. There are many different classes of ships from several different nations to choose from, including some of the most iconic vessels from history, like the massive Imperial Japanese Navy battleship Yamamoto. World of Warship is constantly releasing new content every month. And from now until November 30th, the game is collaborating with the High School Fleet anime series. You know, Japanese schoolgirls and 16-inch deck guns go together quite well. Check out the link down below for more information on World of Warships, and don't forget to use our promo code HSF2023 for a massive starter pack that includes 200 doubloons, 1 million credits, 7 days of premium account time, and 2 High School Fleet commanders. Thank you for your patience. On to the rest of the video. There's always been so many layers in the Star Wars franchise. This is why I think people are so attracted to it. You have the mythology that Lucas always loved talking about, a mixture of Eastern and Western spiritual and religious beliefs, cobbled together in a messy yet believable spiritual belief system that kind of mirrors George Lucas's own self-proclaimed Buddhist/Methodist views. Then you have the hero's journey, the core story about the young man inside of all of us trying to leave the moisture farm to seek fortune and adventure in the wider galaxy. Then you have kind of what I like to call the self-help aspect of Star Wars that talks about, the personal battles we all have to face on a daily basis, like what we do when we're in power and how we use power, how our emotions and relationships with others affect our choices. And these are lessons about love, obsession, hate, and desire, and they're supremely relatable. And then finally, you have the last layer, the all-encompassing layer that's in the background, and that is the politics. In the original trilogy, the politics and messages were still quite vague. I'm pretty sure George Lucas never expected Star Wars to get as large as it did, and so in the original trilogy, especially in that first Star Wars film, the details about the world, the political systems, the governments were kind of limited. But what is visible is George Lucas's very clear 60s era style anti-war ideology. I know some fans might enjoy the Empire's aesthetics or even prefer a strongman dictator in charge and a military-first economy instead of something like the Galactic Republic and the Jedi, but George Lucas, like most of his contemporaries, were at the time and probably still pretty anti-authoritarian. I go as far to call him a leftist, and he once even called himself a radical liberal. That's why when I see people complaining about Disney ruining Star Wars because it's too left-leaning or political, I kind of just laugh because either they've just become Star Wars fans recently, or they've forgotten that Star Wars has always been headed by a very liberal and left-leaning person, probably one of the most left-leaning people in all of Hollywood. I mean, most people in the entertainment sector are left-leaning. That's just how it ends up happening. Just like how most cops and judges are probably a little bit more right-leaning, That's just how society breaks down. You have conservatives and liberals, and you actually need both sides for a properly functioning society. It's when both sides start fighting and you know, disagreeing on everything, that's when things kind of fall apart. But anyway, let's not get sidetracked here. What I want to talk about is this interview between George Lucas and James Cameron, another very, I would say, even more extreme left-wing Hollywood producer. They actually talk about the meaning behind George Lucas's films here.
The good guys are the rebels. They're using asymmetric warfare against a highly organized empire. I think we call those guys terrorists today. We call them Mujahideen, we call them Al-Qaeda.
When I did it, they were Viet Cong.
I think it's an oversimplification to compare Al-Qaeda to the Viet Cong, but you know, as an American, it's kind of hard to watch two great American directors sit there and basically tell us that the Galactic Empire is essentially the United States. Actually, Lucas does state that the Rebel Alliance is somewhat inspired by the American Revolution.
Or a colonial, you know, we're fighting the largest empire in the world.
Right.
And we're just a bunch of hayseeds in coonskin hats who don't know nothing.
But yeah, in general, the idea that Lucas is playing with here is that when a big bad technologically advanced faction fights a bunch of ragtag rebels with homespun tunics and stolen weapons, in Lucas's mind, the little guys and the underdogs are always going to be the good guys. It's a gross oversimplification and it won't hold up in real life, but you know, Lucas is not a great political mind, he's a great filmmaker. That's the difference there, right? And so when George Lucas crafted this line for Anakin Skywalker,
If you're not with me, then you're my enemy.
it's actually a reference to a famous speech that George Bush gave just 10 days after the September 11th attacks. He said the following:
Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
Not really sure how George Lucas responded, but this is how Obi-Wan Kenobi responded.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
Now, I want to give you guys a little bit of context about this line. When George Bush says this line, it was very well received, not only by Americans, but by the entire world. You know, 3,000 Americans had died. Much of the world was furious at what had happened to all of these innocent civilians. There's no invasion of Iraq. We hadn't even entered Afghanistan yet. That would happen just 5 days after that speech. A small group of US Special Forces and combat air controllers would embed with a bunch of Mujahideen riding horses and mules. They would begin launching attacks and airstrikes against Taliban strongholds in the Panjshir Valley. In hindsight, which honestly means jack, that's probably the route we should have kept with. You know, small-scale operations with highly trained individuals going after what essentially was just a small group of terrorists. But no, the operation to kill bin Laden would turn into a much more costly occupation and nation-building exercise, and in 2003 we would invade Iraq for very murky reasons. And despite the initial invasion going very smoothly, like we took out Saddam's army in just a few weeks, an occupation would follow that, and that would also be very problematic. Now, it's reported that Lucas started writing the script for Revenge of the Sith immediately before the production of Episode 2 ended, around September 2000. If you guys remember, Attack of the Clones features that very important scene where Sheev Palpatine gets emergency powers due to the appearance of the Separatist droid army. The first thing it does is it allows Palpatine to exceed his term limits, and it also allows Palpatine to establish a military force, something that hadn't happened in the Republic for 1,000 years. The message behind Episode 2 was clear: don't let fear make you throw away your own rights as citizens in a republic. You know how Benjamin Franklin once said, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." Yeah, that whole sentiment. And a lot of people have said that this scene with Palpatine and his Emergency Powers Act is a direct criticism of George Bush, his administration, specifically his VP Dick Cheney and his team of lawyers. They push forward their own interpretation of the legal concept known as unitary executive theory, which is not symbolized by a triangle. I thought it would just be cool if I did that with my hands. Well, I said that word, but this is a normative theory in United States constitutional law. The concept is that the President of the United States possesses the power to control the entire federal executive branch. Now, this is obviously a very vague and open-ended type of statement, and an extreme interpretation of the unitary executive theory means that basically the president can do whatever the hell he wants, whenever he wants. That includes starting wars without the Senate's approval, which is exactly what Palpatine kind of does when he starts the clone army, bypassing the Senate's approval because haste is needed, to even halting elections or extending term limits in times of great crisis, something Palpatine also did. Now, here's the crazy thing, in case you missed it before, I already said this, but the production for Attack of the Clones ends in 2000. which means that George Lucas most likely came up with the idea of Palpatine's rise to power far earlier than that. And George Bush, he actually wouldn't come into power until November of 2000 when he defeats Al Gore. It was one of the tightest races in electoral history, actually. Bush ended up winning with just 537 more votes in Florida, which gave him the electoral win. Al Gore actually had 500,000 more votes in the popular count, but of course that does not matter. But of course, that matters less than the Electoral College. And in hindsight, you really do have to give Al Gore and the Democrats a bit of credit here. They could have easily challenged the election results for a much longer period of time. This was the closest election in US presidential history. They could have complained that the election system was rigged or unfair, but they didn't. They just accepted the loss, like a real man would. And so unless George Lucas had a time machine, he had no idea that 9/11 would occur and that George Bush would win the election and would eventually try to use his executive powers to circumvent the bureaucratic system and push America into 2 costly wars. As a matter of fact, George Lucas wrote most of the prequels during the Clinton administration, and I actually don't know if George Lucas would have really liked Clinton. I think he was probably a little more left-leaning than Clinton was. Clinton was more of like a centrist Democrat. I think a lot of conservatives and Republicans actually liked Clinton a lot for his kind of anti-regulation policies and stuff like that. But anyway, the only conflict that Clinton was involved in, other than the Somalia situation and the Monica Lewinsky situation, would be the Kosovo War. This period of time is widely considered the peak of Western liberal democracy's power in the world. If I recall correctly, political scientist Francis Fukuyama claimed that the great ideological battles between the East and West were over, communism had been defeated, and Western democracies had won. He even authored the book The End of History and The Last Man. This is what the Western world was actually like during this period from the late 80s up until the early 2000s. The West thought they won. There was a lot of arrogance, hubris, and just blindness to what was going on in the rest of the earth. And some of that arrogance was deserved. I mean, the Soviet Union had collapsed and anti-communist protests had swept the former Soviet Union. And I think George Lucas and his own intellectual circles, well, they were probably caught up in the excitement of it all. Yes, Clinton authorized the use of US military forces, specifically its air assets in Yugoslavia, but they were deployed against NATO forces in an internationally recognized operation. As a matter of fact, the biggest criticism you can give to Bill Clinton when it comes to the use of the military is his lack of use of the military during the Rwandan genocide. The Clinton era was a time period where the world focused on peace. You had the Oslo Accords signed in the beginning of Clinton's first term, and then the 2000 Camp David summit at the end of his second term. We also saw the Good Friday Agreement get signed in 1998. And so my question is, like, if the world was in this place of peace and love and we believed that democracies could do anything, why the heck would George Lucas write something like Attack of the Clones? It's almost as if he saw all the turmoil or chaos coming. I'm gonna say it just comes down to coincidence and luck. I don't think George Lucas is some kind of prophet. He definitely doesn't seem very politically complicated. But what is clear is that in 2003, as American forces started Operation Iraqi Freedom and shock and awed Saddam Hussein's military force into submission, George Lucas might have been one of those minority voices that was actually against the invasion. And at the time, like everyone was for the invasion. Like the support was anywhere from 70 to 80% of Americans around March 2023 when the invasion started. And there was precedence for this. American people were familiar with Saddam Hussein, and he was legitimately one of the worst people in a region full of some truly terrible leaders. Of course, this didn't warrant a full-on military invasion and occupation. That's what the WMDs are for. Although we still haven't found them yet. But yeah, generally speaking, Americans at the time had a decade or so of viewing Saddam Hussein as a cruel dictator who murdered and massacred his own people and was also bent on destroying the United States. And so I think instead of pointing fingers and shaming people for being supportive of the Iraq and Afghanistan invasion back then, the more productive and constructive thing to do is just to realize how easy it is for a populace to completely lose its mind when driven by fear and hatred and revenge. It's a core Star Wars lesson. And I guess George Bush, well, he read the room at the time and he leaned into what exactly people wanted instead of being a voice for calm and reason. Although it should be mentioned that George Lucas himself has said that Dick Cheney was actually the Emperor and that George Bush Jr. was Darth Vader. It's clear that George Lucas believed that Dick Cheney was pulling all the strings and that, George Bush, like Anakin, had been taken along for the ride. I'm not so sure about that. Anyway, a year later, after that initial successful invasion stops and the American forces transition to a full-on occupation, things begin to go wrong and morale begins to plummet amongst both the soldiers and the population at home. It's possible that George Lucas, like a lot of people, would begin questioning the war at this time period. It's more than a year in. There's the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, the capture of Saddam Hussein, the rise of sectarian violence and troop deaths, along with the fact that no one could find the WMD still. Americans were beginning to ask questions about what was going on. And by 2005, with the release of Revenge of the Sith, Lucas had this amazing quote from Anakin, tying in crazy things happening in the real world to what was going on in Star Wars. And so there you have it, guys. That is the history behind this line. Let me know in the comment section below what you think George Lucas was trying to do here. Did he plan this all along, or did he kind of just blend in this pre-planned message he had to current events after 9/11 and the war in Iraq and Afghanistan started? Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.